If someone had told me 6 months ago that the most significant discovery I'd make at the Mount Harding Weather and Research Station would have nothing to do with atmospheric pressure gradients, I would have laughed. A dry, academic little laugh that didn't reach my eyes. Science was my life. It was a world of clean data, predictable variables, and logical conclusions. It was safe. It was knowable. He was none of those things. His name was Cade, and he was the station's caretaker. The man who kept the generators running, the pipes from freezing, and the wilderness at bay. He was a constant, physical presence in a life I had deliberately curated to be cerebral and detached. My days followed a strict, comforting rhythm. Wake at dawn. Check the overnight data feeds. A solitary breakfast of instant oatmeal and black coffee. Hours spent in the comms room, staring at screens that translated the chaos of the weather into neat, elegant lines of code. Lunch. More data. A walk along the station's perimeter if the wind wasn't trying to peel the skin from my face. Dinner from a can. Read a textbook. Sleep. Repeat. It was a life of monastic solitude, and I had chosen it. I told myself I preferred it. People were messy, unpredictable. They were storms I didn't have the instruments to measure. Cade was the messiest variable of all. He existed in my peripheral vision. A blur of dark flannel and denim against the blinding white of the snow. The rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood was the station's heartbeat, a sound so primal it felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. I'd watch him from the lab window, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. He moved with a kind of brutal efficiency. No wasted motion. Each swing of the axe was a perfect arc of contained power. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a ruggedness that seemed carved from the mountain itself. His face, usually set in a neutral, unreadable expression, was all sharp angles and shadow, framed by dark hair that was always a little too long. He was, in a word, intimidating. He spoke only when necessary, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Our interactions were clipped, functional. Generator B is acting up, got a supply drop coming Thursday, storm fronts moving in faster than they predicted. I would just nod, my own voice feeling thin and reedy in comparison. Okay, thanks, I'll check the new models. The distance between us was more than just professional. It felt like a chasm. He was the body, I was the mind. He was the earth, I was the air. I studied the storms, and he was the man who knew how to survive them. I was convinced he saw me as some fragile academic, a city boy utterly useless beyond his computer screen. A liability. This conviction was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. A constant, low-grade anxiety. I found myself performing competence for an audience of one who probably wasn't even watching. I'd carry my own supply boxes from the helipad, even if my arms trembled with the effort. I'd double-check my calculations, terrified of making a mistake he would have to fix. He probably didn't think about me at all. I was just another part of the station. The scientist. A temporary fixture like a faulty sensor or a patch of bad ice. But I thought about him. I thought about him constantly. It was a secret, shameful obsession that felt like a betrayal of my own carefully constructed solitude. I'd lie in my narrow bunk at night, the wind howling a mournful song against the insulated walls, and I wouldn't be thinking about barometric pressure. I'd be thinking about the calluses on his hands, the way the cold reddened the tips of his ears, the quiet intensity in his dark eyes when he was focused on a repair. I was a scientist. I observed. I collected data. And the data on Cade was overwhelming. It pointed to a conclusion my logical mind refused to accept. A conclusion that felt dangerous and impossible. A conclusion that made my heart feel like a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of my ribs. My carefully ordered world, my safe, predictable routine, was about to be shattered. The disruption came, as it always does in the mountains, from the sky. The forecast had called for a significant snow event. A few feet, maybe. High winds. Nothing the station wasn't built to handle. It was just another Tuesday. I was tracking the system's inbound trajectory, my screen a swirl of angry reds and yellows. But there was something off. The pressure was dropping too fast. The wind speed indicators were ticking into the red far sooner than my models had predicted. I felt a prickle of unease. The kind of professional dread that meant my elegant equations were about to be mugged by reality. I walked out of the lab and found Cade in the main room, methodically checking the seals on the windows. He didn't look at me, but he knew I was there. He had a sixth sense for presence, for movement. "It's moving faster than they said," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Much faster," I confirmed, my voice tight. "And it's intensifying. The pressure drop is anomalous." He finally turned to look at me. His gaze was direct, serious. For a second, the chasm between us vanished. We were two men on a mountain, and the mountain was about to get angry. "How bad?" "Bad," I said, the word feeling small and useless. "Potentially the worst storm this station has seen in a decade." He didn't flinch. He just gave a single, sharp nod. "Right. Secure your lab. Tie down anything that isn't bolted to the floor. I'm going to check the exterior one last time." And just like that, he was gone, pulling on a heavy parka and disappearing into the gray, churning twilight. The routine was broken. The inciting incident had arrived, and it was a monster made of wind and ice. The storm hit like a physical blow. One moment, the wind was a high-pitched keen, the next, it was a visceral, deafening roar. The entire station groaned under the assault. Snow, driven horizontally, sandblasted the windows until the world outside was nothing but a roaring, featureless white. We were forced into the main cabin, the central, most fortified part of the station. My lab, with its large observation window, was too exposed. Cade's small, separate quarters were on the far side of the compound. So we were here. Together. In a space that suddenly felt impossibly small. The lights flickered once. Twice. Then, with a sickening buzz, they died. The roar of the storm was joined by a sudden, profound silence, the absence of the generator's hum. We were plunged into darkness. A thick, oppressive black that felt absolute. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind and my own ragged breathing. My heart hammered against my ribs. This is it. This is how it ends. Then, a click. A sharp scratch. A small flame bloomed in the darkness, throwing Cade's face into stark relief. He was holding a Zippo lighter, the flame dancing in his eyes. He looked calm. Unflappable. Of course he was. "Main generators out," he said, his voice even. "Probably a fuel line freeze. We'll have to get the backup going." He moved with purpose through the gloom, lighting the emergency lanterns. Their soft, golden glow pushed back the darkness, creating a small island of warmth and light in the middle of the screaming chaos. The world shrank to the dimensions of this single room. To the space between me and him. Forced proximity. It was no longer a concept. It was our reality. Two men in a box, while the world tried to tear it apart. The backup generator was in the workshed, a small, unheated building connected to the main cabin by a short, covered walkway. The journey of 30 feet felt like a polar expedition. The wind ripped at the walkway's canvas walls, and snow blasted through any tiny gap, stinging our faces. Inside the shed, the cold was brutal. It sank into my bones instantly. Our breath plumed in the beams of our headlamps. The air smelled of diesel, cold metal, and pine. Cade was already kneeling by the generator, a hulking metal beast that looked like it belonged in a submarine. "Hold this," he grunted, passing me a heavy-duty flashlight. I took it, my fingers clumsy in their thick gloves. I directed the beam where he pointed, illuminating a tangle of wires and frozen hoses. This was his world. A world of mechanics and tangible problems. I felt like an intruder, a useless spectator. He worked with a focused intensity, his bare hands moving with surprising dexterity in the freezing air. I watched the muscles in his forearms tense as he wrenched at a frozen bolt. I saw the fine tremor in his fingers as he tried to reseat a delicate wire. He was powerful, but he wasn't invincible. The cold was getting to him, too. My job was simple. Hold the light steady. Don't get in the way. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, I started to see things I'd never noticed from the lab window. There was a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a detail I'd never been close enough to see before. There were deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, a weariness that his confident posture usually concealed. He was biting his lower lip in concentration, a small, human gesture that seemed completely at odds with the mountainman persona I'd built up in my head. He grunted in frustration, pulling his hand back. Damn thing's iced over. Connector won't seat. I leaned in, peering past his shoulder. Let me see. He shifted, giving me room. The beam of my headlamp caught the glint of ice crystals inside a small plastic housing. He was right. It was completely frozen. We need to thaw it, I said, thinking aloud. Carefully. We can't risk damaging the contacts. He looked at me, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, in his eyes. Got a better idea, Professor. The old sarcasm. The familiar distance. But something was different. He was asking for an idea. He was stuck. My scientific mind, the part of me that was actually useful, kicked in. My hands are smaller, I said, pulling off my thick outer gloves, leaving only a thin liner. And warmer, since I haven't been touching frozen metal. Let me try. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. He moved aside. The power dynamic, for one brief, dizzying moment, had shifted. I knelt beside him, our shoulders almost touching. The space felt charged, electric. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the shed. I reached into the generator's guts, my smaller fingers able to access the tight space more easily. I cupped my hands around the frozen connector, letting the warmth of my body slowly, patiently, melt the ice. He held the main flashlight, its beam now focused on my hands. He was watching me. I could feel his gaze, a physical weight on the back of my neck. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Don't tremble. Don't be clumsy. After a minute, the ice began to yield. I worked the connector gently, wiggling it back and forth until, with a soft click, it seated. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until it rushed out of me in a white cloud. Got it. Good work, Cade said. The words were quiet, almost lost in the howl of the storm. But I heard them. He reached for the starter cord. All right, stand back, he gave it a powerful pull. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered on, casting harsh shadows across the shed. We had light. We had power. We had done it. Together. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. I stood up, turning to face him. He was smiling. Not a big, toothy grin, but a small, tired, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and erasing some of the weariness. Told you we'd get it, he said. I didn't doubt it, I lied. As he turned to gather his tools, the back of his hand brushed against mine. It was nothing. An accident. A fleeting contact of frozen wool glove against my thin liner. But it sent a jolt of pure electricity through my entire body. A searing, white-hot shock that stole my breath. My mind went completely blank. All coherent thought evaporated, replaced by the ghost of that touch, the phantom sensation of his skin against mine. It was a brand. He didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he gave no sign. He just kept packing his tools, his movements as efficient as ever. But for me, everything had changed. The first touch. It was a data point my system couldn't process. It was a variable that threw every one of my equations into chaos. My carefully constructed wall of professional distance, of intellectual detachment, had been breached. And I was terrified. And I was hopeful. My stomach was a swarm of bees, a buzzing, nervous energy that was both exhilarating and nauseating. Back in the main cabin, the warmth was a blessing. The lights were on, the heaters were humming, and the roar of the storm outside felt less threatening, more like a distant problem. The immediate crisis was over. But a new one was just beginning, right here, inside me. Cade was at the small kitchenette, making coffee. The simple, domestic act seemed surreal after the tension in the workshed. I stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, feeling exposed and out of place, rubbing my hands together to restore circulation. My skin still tingled where he had touched me. You should get out of those wet clothes, he said, his back to me. I'll put some water on to boil. You can have the first shower. The water heater will take a while to catch up. It was the most he'd said to me in a single stretch since I'd arrived. The offer was practical, sensible. But it felt like something more. An act of care. The thought made my chest ache. I retreated to my small room, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm. I peeled off my damp layers, my fingers fumbling with the buttons on my shirt. My mind was a maelstrom, replaying the moment in the shed over and over. The way he'd looked at me. The sound of his voice saying, "Good work," the accidental brush of our hands. I was overthinking it. I was a scientist, for God's sake. I was supposed to be rational. It was a meaningless event, a statistical anomaly. But my body didn't care about statistics. My body was still humming with the aftershock of that touch. The storm raged for 3 days. 3 days of being trapped in the station, the world outside a terrifying, beautiful blur of white. The isolation was absolute. No internet. No satellite phone. Just the two of us. The hours bled into each other. We fell into a strange, new routine. A domesticity born of necessity. We took turns cooking, our meals cobbled together from the station's ample supply of canned goods and dried foods. I discovered that Cade was a surprisingly good cook, able to turn beans and tinned tomatoes into something deeply comforting. I, in turn, showed him how to recalibrate the station's internal atmospheric sensors, a task that required a delicate touch he grudgingly admitted I was better at. The chasm between us began to fill in. We talked. Not about anything profound, at first. We talked about the storm, about the station's structural integrity, about our dwindling supply of fresh coffee. But slowly, tentatively, the conversations deepened. He asked me about my research. And he actually listened, his dark eyes focused and intelligent as I tried to explain the complexities of atmospheric river dynamics. He didn't treat me like a professor talking down to him, he treated me like an expert in my field. I learned things about him, too. He'd grown up in Montana, on a ranch. He'd joined the army and served 2 tours in Afghanistan, working in logistics. He didn't talk about combat, but he spoke of the vast, empty landscapes, the searing heat, the feeling of being a million miles from home. He came here, to the top of this mountain, for the quiet. One night, the third night, the wind finally began to die down. The roaring monster outside softened into a mournful whisper. The silence it left behind was vast and heavy. We were sitting in the main room, by the small pot-bellied stove that Cade kept fed with a steady supply of wood. The electric lights were off, by mutual unspoken agreement. The room was lit only by the flickering, hypnotic dance of the flames. He had produced a bottle of surprisingly good whiskey from a locked cabinet. We drank it from coffee mugs, the warmth spreading through my chest, loosening the knot of anxiety that was my constant companion. The silence between us was no longer awkward or heavy with unspoken things. It was comfortable. Companionable. "You're always watching me," he said, his voice low. He wasn't looking at me, but at the fire. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. My heart stopped. My blood ran cold, then hot. I was caught. Exposed. The scientist observed. My throat went dry. I'm an observer. It's what I do. It was a weak, pathetic excuse. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You look at me like I'm a puzzle you're trying to solve." He turned his head then, and his eyes met mine in the firelight. The shadows carved his face into something ancient and serious. Am I? The directness of the question disarmed me completely. All my carefully constructed defenses crumbled. The whiskey had burned away my caution. Honesty, raw and terrifying, was the only thing left. "Yes," I whispered, the word barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "I guess you are." He held my gaze for a long moment. I felt like he was seeing straight through me, past the nervous academic, to the lonely, yearning core of me. I couldn't look away. "What have you figured out?" he asked, his voice even softer now. My heart was a hummingbird, a frantic blur of motion. "Tell him. Tell him now, or you never will." "I figured out," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "that you're not what I thought you were." I thought you were angry. Or that you disliked me. I took a shaky breath. I've figured out that you're quiet, not angry. And that you're competent. And kind. The last word hung in the air between us, fragile and luminous. He looked away, back into the flames. A muscle worked in his jaw. The silence stretched, and with every second, my panic grew. I had said too much. I had misread everything. I had ruined this fragile, tentative peace between us. I was an idiot. Kind, he repeated, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. He gave a short, bitter laugh that had no humor in it. Not a word most people would use for me. Most people are wrong, I said, with a sudden, uncharacteristic boldness. He set his mug down on the floor with a soft thud. He shifted on the small sofa, turning his body to face me more fully. The space between us shrank. I could feel the heat of him, smell the faint scent of wood smoke, whiskey, and something that was uniquely, intoxicatingly him. You know, Leo, he said, using my first name for what felt like the first time. I watch you too. My breath hitched in my throat. I see you in the lab, staring at your screens for hours. So focused. The way you push your glasses up your nose when you're concentrating. I see you walking the perimeter, all bundled up against the wind, looking so serious. Like you're carrying the weight of the world. He paused, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. I used to think you were fragile. I was wrong. You're the toughest person I know. The words hit me like a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs. Fragile was how I'd always seen myself. It was how I assumed he saw me. To hear him say the opposite, it undid me. He reached out then, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't touch my hand, or my arm. He cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbone. His hand was large, warm, the calluses on his palm a rough, grounding texture against my skin. My eyes fluttered shut. This was it. The turning point. The moment where the data becomes the event. Is this okay? He whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. I couldn't speak. I could only nod, a small, jerky movement. He leaned in, and the world narrowed to the inches between our faces. His breath was warm, tasting of whiskey. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine, asking a final, silent question. I gave him the only answer I had. I leaned forward, closing the last bit of distance between us. His lips were softer than I could have ever imagined. The kiss wasn't frantic or passionate. It was slow. Tentative. A question and an answer all at once. It was a discovery. It was the taste of loneliness and longing and a quiet, desperate hope. He kissed me like he was trying to learn the shape of me, and I kissed him back like I was finally coming home. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. I woke to the pale, gray light of dawn. For a moment, I was disoriented. I was in my own bunk, in my own cold, sterile room. The familiar scent of antiseptic cleaner and old books filled my nostrils. Then memory flooded back, a tidal wave of heat and sensation. The fire. The whiskey. The impossible softness of Cade's lips. The weight of his body next to mine on the sofa. We hadn't done more than kiss, but those kisses had stretched for hours, a long, slow exploration in the flickering firelight. Eventually, exhausted, we had simply fallen asleep, my head on his shoulder. He must have carried me here. The thought sent a fresh wave of heat through me. He had carried me to my bed and tucked me in like I was something precious. But he wasn't here now. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in my stomach, chilling the warm afterglow of the night before. I sat up, listening. The station was silent. Not the howling silence of the storm, but a deep, unnerving quiet. The wind had died completely. I pulled on my clothes, my fingers feeling clumsy and thick. I walked into the main room. It was empty. The stove was cold, a pile of gray ash in its belly. His whiskey mug was gone. Mine sat alone on the small table where I'd left it. The sofa cushions were plumped, the throw blanket folded neatly over the arm. There was no trace of what had happened here. It was as if it had been erased. My anxiety tightened its icy grip. He regrets it. It was a mistake. A drunken, cabin fever-induced mistake. I looked out the main window. The world was transformed. A pristine, glittering blanket of white covered everything, the snow so deep it buried the walkway railings. And in the distance, a figure. Cade. He was shoveling a path from the main door to the workshed, his movements powerful and rhythmic. Back to work. Back to normal. He was 1,000 miles away. The chasm had opened up again, wider and more terrifying than before because now I knew what it was like to stand on the other side. My former solitude, the one I had cultivated and cherished, returned with a vengeance. But it was different now. It was tainted. Before, it had been a quiet, empty room. Now, it was a room that screamed with the absence of him. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I retreated to my lab. My sanctuary. I threw myself into my work, trying to lose myself in the familiar comfort of data. I collated the storm readings, ran diagnostics, wrote up my initial findings. I worked with a frantic, desperate energy, trying to outrun my own thoughts. It didn't work. Every number on the screen, every line of code, seemed to mock me. What did any of this matter? What good were my predictions and models when I couldn't even predict the behavior of the men in the next room? We didn't speak all day. I saw him from my window, moving about the station, doing his chores. Securing a loose antenna. Checking the solar panels. He never looked toward the lab. Not once. I made myself a solitary lunch, my stomach churning. I ate it standing up in my lab, staring at a weather map, the food tasting like ash in my mouth. The self-recrimination was a vicious, repeating loop in my head. I had been a fool. I had mistaken proximity and shared crisis for something real. He was lonely, I was there, and we both had too much whiskey. That was the simple, brutal equation. And now, in the cold light of day, he was embarrassed. He was putting up walls, re-establishing the distance, and I had to do the same. I had to pretend it never happened. The thought was unbearable. It felt like a betrayal of the honesty, the vulnerability, we had shared. But what choice did I have? I couldn't force him to want what I wanted. I couldn't demand that the night meant the same thing to me as it did to him. So I hid. I hid in my lab, behind my screens, surrounded by the cold, hard facts of the weather, while the emotional storm inside me raged unchecked. The silence stretched. It became a living thing, a third presence in the station. It sat between us at the dinner table that night. We ate without speaking, the only sounds the clinking of our forks against the plates. I couldn't look at him. I was afraid of what I would see in his eyes. Pity. Regret. Annoyance. It was better not to know. After dinner, I cleared my plate and practically fled back to my lab. I closed the door, leaning against it, my heart aching with a profound, desolate loneliness that was far worse than anything I had ever felt before. I had been given a glimpse of a different kind of life, a different version of myself. And then the door had been slammed shut in my face. The recoil was brutal, a whiplash that left me breathless and bruised. I stayed in the lab late into the night, long after the station had fallen quiet. I wasn't working. I was just sitting in the dark, watching the newly emerged stars glitter in the ink-black sky. They looked cold and impossibly far away. Just like him. A soft knock on the door made me jump. My heart leaped into my throat. It had to be him. There was no one else. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My voice was trapped in my chest. The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. Leo. His voice. Low and rough through the wood of the door. Hearing him say my name sent a tremor through me. I took a deep, shaky breath. Come in. The door opened, and he was there, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He looked big and solid and overwhelmingly present. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The small room suddenly felt charged, the air thick with everything we hadn't said all day. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood there by the door, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. I couldn't see his expression clearly in the gloom, which was probably for the best. You've been in here all day, he said. Another statement of fact. I had a lot of data to process from the storm, I said, my voice sounding stiff and formal to my own ears. He was silent for a moment. I could hear the faint hum of my computer's cooling fan. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. "Are we going to pretend last night didn't happen?" he asked, his voice raw. The directness, again. It cut through all my carefully prepared defenses. "I thought that's what you wanted," I managed to say, the words tasting like defeat. "You've been distant." He let out a long, weary sigh. He moved away from the door, walking slowly toward the large window that looked out over the valley. The starlight illuminated the side of his face. He looked tired. And more than that, he looked uncertain. The confident, capable man was gone. In his place was someone who looked just as lost as I felt. "I'm not good at this, Leo," he said, his voice quiet. He was talking to the window, not to me. "This, whatever this is. I don't have a manual for it." He turned to face me then, and even in the dim light, I could see the vulnerability in his eyes. It was the same vulnerability I'd seen by the firelight, but magnified. "I woke up this morning," he said, "and you were asleep, and for a second, everything felt right. Simple. And it terrified me." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound frustration. "My whole life, when things get complicated, I fall back on work. On routine. Fix the generator. Shovel the path. Keep busy. It's all I know how to do. I didn't know how to act around you. I didn't want to push you, or make you feel crowded. So I did what I always do. I put my head down and worked. I built a wall because I didn't know what else to do. It was stupid." Every word he spoke chipped away at the icy shell of my own fear and misunderstanding. He hadn't been rejecting me. He had been scared. Just like me. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming, it felt like I could finally breathe again after holding my breath all day. "I thought you regretted it," I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. "I thought it was a mistake." He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides. He stopped right in front of me, so close I had to tilt my head back to look at him. He reached out and took my hands. His were warm and firm, engulfing mine completely. It wasn't an accident this time. It was an anchor. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at me. It wasn't a mistake. The only mistake was me being a coward this morning." He lifted one of my hands and pressed a soft kiss to the knuckles. My knees went weak. "I don't want to go back to how it was," he said, his dark eyes searching mine. "The silence. The distance. I don't want that anymore." "Me neither," I breathed, my heart feeling like it might burst from my chest. He held my gaze, a silent promise passing between us. Then a small, practical smile touched his lips. "It's cold in your room. And your bunk is too small." It was such a Cade thing to say. Practical. Grounded. And yet, it was the most romantic thing I had ever heard. "My room's warmer," he continued. "And the bed's bigger. You should move your things in." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A solution to a logistical problem. But it was also a symbolic gesture of staggering significance. He was offering me space. Not just in his room, but in his life. He was tearing down the wall, brick by brick. I couldn't find any words. So I just squeezed his hands and nodded. A wide, genuine smile broke across his face, the one I had seen in the workshed. The one that made him look 10 years younger. "Good," he said. "That's good." And in the quiet of my lab, surrounded by the cold, impartial instruments of science, I finally understood. Love wasn't an equation to be solved. It was a storm to be weathered. Together. The next morning, I woke up to warmth. Not just the warmth of the thick down comforter, but the solid, living heat of Cade's body next to mine. He was still asleep, lying on his stomach, one arm flung over my waist in a possessive, unconscious embrace. The gray morning light filtered through the window of his room, painting everything in soft, muted tones. His room was sparse, functional, but it felt like a home in a way my own sterile quarters never had. A worn leather-bound book on the nightstand. A faded photograph of a mountain range that wasn't this one. A pair of scuffed work boots by the door. These were the small, intimate details of his life, and he had invited me into them. I lay there for a long time, not moving, just breathing in the quiet rhythm of the new day. There was no anxiety. No frantic spiral of doubt. The knot of fear that had lived in my stomach for as long as I could remember was gone, replaced by a sense of profound, tranquil peace. This felt right. Real. He stirred, his arm tightening around me. He made a low, sleepy sound in his throat and buried his face in the pillow next to my head. "Morning," I whispered. He mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Not yet." I smiled, tracing the line of his spine over his t-shirt. He was the toughest guy I knew, a man who could face down a blizzard and wrestle a generator into submission. But here, in the quiet morning, in my arms, he was something else entirely. He was vulnerable. He was soft. He was mine. We fell into a new rhythm, one dictated not by necessity and survival, but by choice and affection. We made coffee together, our bodies brushing past each other in the small kitchenette with an easy familiarity. We shared meals, the conversation flowing easily now, punctuated by comfortable silences. We worked, me in my lab and he around the station, but the distance was gone. Now, there was a current of connection humming between us, a quiet awareness of the other's presence. The storm had isolated us from the world, but it had connected us to each other. It had stripped away our facades, our routines, our defenses, and left us with nothing but the raw, honest truth of who we were. One afternoon, days later, the crackle of the comms unit broke the long silence. A voice, tinny and distant, filtered through. The outside world, returning. A part of me, the old me, felt a jolt of relief. But a bigger part felt a pang of regret, a sadness that our strange, perfect isolation was coming to an end. Cade came and stood behind me as I answered the call, his hand resting on the back of my chair. A simple, public gesture of connection. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't afraid. As I look back on that time, I see my life as two distinct phases, before the storm, and after. Before, I was an observer, a man who lived behind glass, studying the world but never truly touching it. I had convinced myself that solitude was strength, that emotional risk was a fool's game. Cade was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the anomalous data point that forced me to reevaluate all my theories. He didn't just disrupt my routine, he disrupted my entire existence, in the most profound and wonderful way. He taught me that true strength isn't about building walls to keep the world out, it's about having the courage to let someone in. The mountain taught me about atmospheric pressure and wind shear, but he taught me about intimacy, trust, and the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of loving someone. I came to this remote outpost looking for scientific certainty, for the clean, predictable logic of the natural world. Instead, I found the messy, unpredictable, illogical chaos of the human heart. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had finally discovered something real. I had discovered home.